Since really embracing magic and doing more of it, I've learned so much more about magic, and it's made me fall in love with it even more. So in this video, I want to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned from magic that magic has taught me about itself. So the first lesson I found is that magic challenges perceptions of how it manifests. And I think part of this relates to trying to let go of how the magic will come about, how it will work. I must admit that often when I do a piece of magic, I have an idea in my mind of how I perhaps assume it will turn out. I don't think that's ever been the case, that it has turned out the way that I thought, but that doesn't matter, because when it does happen, when the magic does manifest, and it is in the way that it manifests, that makes it much more magical to me. I think there is something about not getting what you want in exactly the way you expect it, perhaps because it gives the impression that magic has its own way of doing things, its own autonomy. I don't know if that's true, but it just comes across that way when it feels like magic has made something happen, but it's decided the way that it's going to happen. The next lesson I found is that performing simple acts of magic is no less powerful. I perform both sigil magic and also perhaps more what you would call elaborate rituals, and I've not noticed any difference in terms of the outcomes or the power of the outcomes between those two methods. Maybe you have noticed a difference, but for me, that's not the case. So you might be wondering then, well, why don't you just do sigil magic? Because that's easier, it's quicker. For me, there tends to be a sense of when a piece of magic requires a bit more ritual to it, and that's my personal perception of it. It's not that there's a specific rule around something. I think about what I want to incorporate into that magic, what is going to help me to feel on a psychological level that that is a powerful way to perform the magic. Sometimes it might be simple through a sigil, but other times it feels as though something a bit more elaborate and structured would be better. Not just in terms of the magic being performed, but if I'm working with certain entities, it feels as though that would be more respectful of them and more encouraging of them to help me. And again, I'm not saying that that is definitely the case. That is just my perception and way of doing it. The next lesson I've learned is that consistency is key. I mean, you could probably apply this to most areas of life. The more you do magic, the more you see of it. And I don't mean that necessarily just in terms of, because the hope is you'll get more results if you do more magic. What I mean is also seeing synchronicities in the world around you that may have nothing to do with the magic you've performed, but I feel that there are certain things that I see that are meant to be little messages for me to make me kind of just stop and pause. And I know there's a danger of getting into a mindset that everything's a sign. I do try and be careful of that, because I don't think everything is a sign. But generally, if something stops me in my tracks and gives me pause for thought, I feel that that's a sign. Whereas if I have to think hard about it and think, well, is that or isn't it? Then generally I don't. If it really kind of grabs hold of me and takes me back a bit, I feel that that's meant for me to notice. The next lesson is that magic is a mixture, a recipe, if you like, of knowledge, so doing reading around it, skill, actually putting the magic into practice, and I do think a bit of intuition. I'm not saying that we should just throw all the rules out, throw all the correspondences away. I'm a bit of a believer of once you know what the rules are, you can begin to break them, you can start to experiment, because then you've always got your foundations to go back on. And I think the recipe of magic, you may have other ingredients that you want to add to that recipe. I found that those things are helpful to keep in mind rather than, say, for example, relying on knowledge alone, because if you're reading all the time, you're not practicing. If you're doing magic all the time, that is good, but it helps now and then to go back to the books and the sources, especially if perhaps you're trying a new piece of magic, looking at what people have done before and having a think about whether you want to try what they've done or sort of take bits and pieces from what they've done. And also it's got to feel right, I think, as well. I don't think there's any point in performing a piece of magic that doesn't feel right for whatever reason. So figuring out why it doesn't feel right, what's jarring, what doesn't sit right with you. So I think the ingredient of magic, the recipe, for me tends to be made up of all those things. Lesson 5 is the more magic you do, the more magical life becomes. Now this is different to the one I said previously about sort of seeing synchronicities and stuff like that. What I found is that when magic works and we see it work, we see the results, it gets you thinking about what really is going on then. I don't have any idea about how magic works. If anyone had claimed to have the definitive answer about how it works, I don't know if I would believe them, because my view is that this world and this universe is far too complex for us to be figuring this stuff out. But that's part of the mystery and the love of it and the fascination. What is going on when we put our desires out there and we perform magic to ask for those desires to manifest? It's a mystery, and it's a wonderful mystery. For me, it's added more of a sense of wonder about life, and I think that's important in a world that at times can feel really devoid of anything. When there's so many terrible things going on, I think we need a reminder that the world isn't all bad. There's a lot of joy and wonder to be had from it. The next lesson is, when magic happens, you know. I've alluded to this earlier a bit with the synchronicities. So when I've had magic that's worked, I've known. It's not like, oh, that's happened and I did a magical working. Are those two things related? If I'm doing that internally, it feels like I'm really trying to work hard to convince myself, and therefore I usually discount whether that was magic or not. Whereas when something hits me and I realise that that is related to a piece of magic I worked, when it hits me and it's like, oh, right. There's not even any thought process about whether that's true or not. It's just like, that's it. That's my experience of it. You may have different experiences, let me know. But I found there's no question that that's the magic working. But you might think from that what I'm referring to is that it manifests in a way that almost like smacks me in the face and it's so obvious and out there. Bright lights and loud music and choirs of angels and all that stuff. But I don't mean that. And that leads me into the next lesson, is that sometimes magic can be so subtle you might miss it. There have been ways that my magic has manifested that have been subtle in the sense that they don't look out of the ordinary. They're part of ordinary life. But when I've suddenly twigged, oh, that relates to that piece of magic I worked, then it's like that powerful, oh, okay. Let me know if you've experienced magic that is like the total opposite of subtle and it has been really in your face. I'd love to hear any accounts of that. But my magic has been almost sort of weaved into daily life. Things have happened, life's been going along, and then something will happen and it stops me dead. Nobody else would notice it. Nobody else would know that a piece of magic has manifested, but I know it because it's what I've asked for. And again, that for me just makes me love magic so much, because it can be so very subtle. It's hidden in the fabric of our day-to-day lives, but it's so powerful. Let me know down in the comments the lessons that you've learned from magic as you've gone through your practice. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Take care, be well, and I'll speak to you soon.